Dorsey Jackson Global.
It has begun.
It started when I was 14 years old. I had gone to bed the night before in my home, but when I woke up, I realized that I was lying on a bench in our town's park. Now, I loved going to the park when I was a kid, as my dad used to take me there before he passed. It was a place I always felt safe, but that morning, I was extremely confused as to how I got there and why I was still wearing my PJs. My mind couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for it, so I made my way home. When I finally arrived, I saw the worried looks on my mom's and her then-boyfriend Thomas Wyatt faces. As they rushed to hug me, my mom told me that she was extremely worried when she couldn't find me in my room that morning, and she was just about to call the cops as they really thought I was missing. Confused and upset, my mom asked why I left the house late at night. But I was just as confused as her, and I told her I didn't remember leaving the house. The confusion just rose from there, till our neighbor, old lady Margaret, told my mom and me that she caught a glimpse of me sleepwalking very late last night. I never had a problem with sleepwalking before, so my mom took me to see a doctor. The doctor told my mom that the sleepwalking could have been caused by numerous things, but she assured my mom that it was a common phase in a growing child's life, and I would eventually grow out of it. My mom felt calmer after hearing that, and she assumed that it was going to be a one-night thing, but unfortunately for her, that was just the beginning, as I started to constantly sleepwalk every single night after that day. Just like the first night, every time I sleepwalked, I would always wake up at the park. Most nights, my mom stayed up and made numerous attempts to wake me, but I was told I would scream anytime someone tried to. Most of the time, it felt like they were telling me stories about another person, as I absolutely couldn't recall doing the things they said I did. After a while, I could tell my sleepwalking problem was getting worse, as it showed no signs of stopping. Apparently, during the previous night, my mom's boyfriend, Thomas, had managed to carry me back to my room when I sleepwalked out of the house, but I didn't stay there for long, as I was told I left my room a few minutes later. That's when they realized that even putting me back in my room didn't stop the sleepwalking. Thomas had been really supportive of me and my mom during the sleepwalking phase. He was a really nice guy, and he was the only one of my mom's numerous boyfriends who made an effort to get to know me, as he always tried his best to get close to me. Through all this, he gave me and my mom reassuring words, and he was always there to lend a helping hand. But even with the help of both Thomas and my mom, the sleepwalking didn't stop. They eventually tried to lock my room's door, but I was told I would scream till it was opened. More visits to the doctor were made, and the doctor told my mom that locking me in my room wouldn't solve anything, as making me feel trapped will just make things worse. As this went on, it didn't take long before I noticed my mom was really worried. So that night, I decided to do something about it. I decided to pull an all-nighter, as I believed that if I stayed awake all night, I would be able to overcome the recurring sleepwalking. Things went fine at first, as I managed to stay awake for most of the night. But once the clock struck 12:30, I felt intense fear, as each and every hair on my body began to stand. I didn't know why I suddenly got scared, as there was nothing in my room, but the crippling fear just rose from there. I tried my best to fight it, but my body wanted to leave my room, and the only word that was screaming through my mind was run. Words can't really explain how I felt that night, as I wondered what I was supposed to be scared of in my own home. It was nearing 1 o'clock a.m. now, and the overwhelming fear really started to get to me. I eventually couldn't take it anymore, as my body told me that I needed to run now. So I agreed. I made my way to the door, and as I opened it, I saw my mom's boyfriend, Thomas, standing in front of the door. Then I ran into his arms as I said, "I'm so glad you're here, Thomas. I'm really scared. and I don't know why. I'm also really confused, and all I know is that my gut told me I needed to get out of my room now. When I was done talking, I looked at Thomas, who now had a sick grin on his face. He then looked at me and said,
"Now, my sweet Claire, I need you to be a good girl and behave nicely for me. I promise I'll have my fun and you won't remember a thing when I'm done. I'm so happy that you're in your room tonight, my sweet Claire. After our first wonderful night together, I wanted to spend all my nights with you. But you started sleepwalking and I could never find you in your room. I even tried to put you back in your room on most nights, but you always left again. Thankfully, you finally overcome that problematic issue tonight and you've come running right back into my arms."
Appalled, I stepped back from him as I had a horrific realization. At first, I thought it was just a bad dream, but everything from that night started coming back to me. I remembered how he came into my room and pressed a white cloth over my nose. I remembered how powerless I was to do anything, as the chemical he used to drug me was potent. I then finally realized why I was so terrified, as it happened at exactly 1 a.m. on that fateful night. I recalled how I didn't tell my mom about it because the chemical I was drugged with made me forget most of what happened, and it also made me feel like it was just a bad dream. Terrified, I looked at Thomas, who was now bringing out the same white cloth from his pocket. He then walked up to me as he said,
"Now, my sweet Claire, I need you to be a good girl and behave nicely for me. I promise I'll have my fun and you won't remember a thing when I'm done."
I tried to run out of the room, but he grabbed me before I could reach the door. He tried to force the cloth over my nose, but I struggled and resisted. I started to fight back, and I managed to bite his hand really hard. He screamed from the pain as he threw me across the room. My whole body ached now, but I wasn't going to give up. I started to scream out my mom's name as I crawled toward the door. My mom, who had become a light sleeper ever since I started to sleepwalk, rushed into the room. It didn't take long before she realized what was going on, and she started to protect me by fending off his repeated attacks. He was far stronger than her, and it didn't take long before my mother was being beaten by the man who she thought loved her. I knew my mom gave me a chance, and I wasn't going to waste it, so I ran. I ran all the way out of the house to see old lady Margaret standing on our lawn with a phone in her hand. She said she had heard screaming, so she decided to call the cops, and it didn't take long before I started to hear the sirens. After that traumatizing experience, Thomas Wyatt was arrested and given up to 30 years in prison. I had to see numerous psychologists after that experience, and with the knowledge of the incident, they told my mom and me that the cause of the sleepwalking was my body subconsciously trying to protect itself while I slept by automatically undergoing the fight or flight response seen in humans when danger is near. She then added that the body takes itself to somewhere it feels safe, which is why I kept waking up at the park. The psychologist then told me and my mom that sleepwalking cases like these were very rare. After the incident, my mom constantly blamed herself for bringing that man into our house. I always told her it wasn't her fault and that I didn't blame her for anything that happened that night. For a period after that, even though I was 15 years old, I found myself sleeping in the same bed as my mom, just like I used to when I was a kid. I always felt safe whenever I did that, and after those nights, I never went sleepwalking again.
The strange phenomenon hit our town like an epidemic. It originally started with a girl named Valerie Maverick, as she was one of the first children who started sleepwalking in our little town. Then it moved on to Ezekiel Jameson, and it didn't take long before every single one of the kids in my grade started sleepwalking. I was 13 at the time, and I was in the 8th grade, and I remember that when the numerous reports of mass sleepwalking started to occur, it perplexed all the doctors, psychologists, and scientists in our town. The strange occurrence baffled all of them, as somnambulism, widely known as sleepwalking, wasn't a contagious activity. Things were fine at first, as most specialists calmed troubled parents by telling them that everything was going to be fine. But it didn't take long before a mass panic started to happen in our town, as some of the children who left their homes while sleepwalking never came back the next morning. Troubled parents started locking their children's doors at night, but that just made things worse, because in an attempt to get out of the room while sleepwalking, most children viciously banged their heads against the door until someone opened it. And some even went as far as jumping out of their high windows to their deaths. The horrific news started making headlines, as doctors and specialists had never seen sleepwalking cases as peculiar as these. Strangely, the sleepwalking epidemic only affected children who were aged between 12 and 13, so it was mainly children in the 8th grade. Since locking them up was a bad option, efforts were made to follow these children in order to see where they were going. And after trailing them, they realized that after leaving their respective houses, all the children gathered in a secluded area behind the town school and waited patiently until they woke up the next morning. Now, I was one of the few kids in the 8th grade who wasn't affected by the strange sleepwalking phenomenon. And at the time, I guessed it was because I didn't really sleep much at night. I usually spent most of my nights playing video games or watching anime, and I always went to bed early in the morning rather than at night. But one night, while I was gaming, I felt myself dozing off as I was extremely sleepy. I found it really odd, as my body had gotten accustomed to staying up all night. I tried to shake off the sleep, but I couldn't. And the last thing I remember that night was closing my eyes for a second before I woke up the next morning at the back of my school, surrounded by my classmates. My father had come to get me as I had apparently dozed off and started sleepwalking. I was scared now, as the strange sleepwalking phenomenon had finally gotten to me. But I was determined not to do it again. So that night, I snuck into the kitchen and drank a lot of extra caffeinated coffee. After doing that, I felt more awake than ever before. But after a couple of hours, I felt my eyes shutting themselves, just like the night before. I tried to fight it again, but it felt like I was being forced to sleep by an unseen force. I continued to fight the urge to sleep till I eventually felt myself entering a trance-like state. It's hard to put into words, but it was almost like I was asleep and awake at the same time. I felt my body move on its own, and no matter how much I tried to stop it, I couldn't, as it truly felt like my body had a mind of its own. I saw myself walk out of the house and down the street to school. The scene terrified me as I watched my classmates leave their houses and walk like they were being pulled by invisible strings towards the school. From what I can remember, it looked like a really messed up class activity. Like last night, we all finally gathered at the back of our school. We waited there motionless for a while, till I saw someone emerge from the bushes. His name was Francis Harrison, and he was our 8th grade English teacher. Now, I could never really remember what happened in Mr. Harrison's class, as I always zoned out for some reason. But I felt like he was one of my favorite teachers, as his classes always made me feel calm. Confused as to what he was doing there, I watched him bring out a phone as he said, "They weren't followed tonight. Bring over the van immediately." A black van then rolled out almost immediately, and I saw a very shady man walk out of it. Mr. Francis then said, "Stand still, children." And even though everyone was asleep, their bodies all obeyed. He and the strange man started to look through the children as the man said, "I only want the best quality. This one looks like she will fetch a fine price." He then pointed to one of my classmates, Ruby Pierce. Mr. Francis then looked at her and said, "Now, be a good girl, Ruby, and hop in the van." I watched in horror as Ruby, who was still sleeping, obeyed his words and walked into the van. One by one, I watched as they picked off my classmates, before they finally reached me. I stood motionless as I heard the man say, "What's wrong with this one? His eyes are half open. He doesn't look like he's fully under your control like the others." Mr. Francis then said, "He is. I'll show you. Leonardo Scott, I want you to go into that van right this second." As he spoke, my body began to move towards the van. Scared now, I started to strongly fight whatever was controlling me. It took a lot of strength, But after a while, I managed to regain a little control, so I let out a gut-wrenching scream. My scream sent the other kids into a frenzy as they all started to act up. Shocked, Mr. Francis rushed towards me as he tried to silence my screams, but I instinctively knew what to do when defending myself from people much bigger than me. So, I went for his eyes by thrusting a couple of my fingers into them. He screamed, and he finally let go of me, and so I started to run. The loud noise of frantic children had alerted a nearby security guard, and the cops were called immediately. The next day, I was called in by some of the police officers, as I was the only kid who regained some form of consciousness through everything that happened that night. I then told them everything that I saw, and an investigation was carried out into Mr. Francis's life. It didn't take long before it was revealed that the man called Mr. Francis Harrison never existed. He was using a fake identity, and his real name was Dmitry Oslo. He was a hardened Russian criminal who was wanted in over 40 states. He was also a notorious child trafficker and kidnapper who used forms of advanced hypnosis in addition to scopolamine, widely known as devil's breath, to kidnap his victims easily and willingly. Eventually, traces of the drug were found in our system, and after a while, the memory of what actually happened during his supposed English classes started coming back to us, as we recalled how he hypnotized and instructed each and every one of us to walk to the back of the school every night while we were sleeping. The case baffled the detectives, and an explanation for the mass sleepwalking phenomenon was finally given. A manhunt was set out to find Mr. Francis Harrison, but unfortunately, he hasn't been found till this very day.